fighting, myself and along with a number of other people from North America and Western Europe, were invited to attend a conference that took place in Yalta, Crimea on July 6th and 7th, which was composed mostly of anti-war activists, social rights activists from Ukraine, and then many of whom were living in exile in Crimea now, and similar co-thinkers from Russia, and a scattering of people from Eastern Europe. So we gathered for 2 days in Yalta to discuss events and issued two what I think are very excellent declarations on the situation. One was a declaration of anti-war solidarity, and the other was specifically issued by the Ukrainian delegates, and it was really an outlook for a future democratic Ukraine. And you can find both of those declarations on my website. There's some attention drawn to them. And so, and then after a week in Yalta and elsewhere in Crimea, I went to Moscow for 1 week to continue discussions with the delegates who had been at the conference. We have more than 1 million people in Canada who are of Ukrainian descent, and so this is an important place in the world for Canadians as well, many of whom from Ukraine have come here at different points in the past for different reasons, many of which were people escaping harsh conditions of life and looking for a better life in Canada. And so we've had now for the past, well, if we take the cutoff date of September 5th, when the recent ceasefire was declared, 4 months of very intense war in eastern Ukraine, and a war which is at the same time a humanitarian catastrophe. Of course, all wars are catastrophes, but this one ranks up there as far as the numbers of people killed. For example, probably twice the number of people who were killed during Israel's recent war in Gaza. Enormous numbers of refugees who have that this war has caused. These are just very typical scenes of the cities of eastern Ukraine, which were bombed intensely by the Ukrainian government and its various military forces and allied militias, right-wing militias, which carried out intense warfare against what amounts to their own citizens, their own cities, their own towns. And what they're now beginning to find, this is a photo actually earlier today, a different time zone of the world, but these are inspectors of the Organization of Security and Cooperation for Europe who are now looking into the growing numbers of reports of mass graves in eastern Ukraine, in the areas in which the Ukraine army, or more importantly, more precisely, the right-wing and extreme right-wing battalions, militias that have been fighting side by side with the Ukrainian army. And so I think we're going to be, depending on your news source, we'll be hearing a lot more about this in the coming days. Other news sources, you won't hear anything about it. So as you'll learn through my talk, we need to learn where to go to find our news and information. And I mentioned among the consequences are the refugees. There's probably approaching 1 million people now who have had to flee to Russia to escape the bombardments. And they're more or less well looked after in Russia. Russia's not as wealthy as Canada, but it is a country with some capacity to be able to absorb and look after the refugees. That's less the case for the refugees who have gone to different areas of Ukraine, because the resources in Ukraine are much more limited, and frankly, the commitment of the government to look after them is less than the case in Russia as well. But even for those who find perhaps better conditions in Russia, it's still harsh and difficult, and of course the last place where those people want to be living. The Ukraine's population is 45 million people. Those in the immediate war zone are about 6 million. And so those, when I mention the refugee numbers here, most of those who I'm talking about are from the very southeast of Ukraine, specifically the regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. Conscription was abolished last year in Ukraine, but it was reinstituted by the right-wing government that came into power in February. And so many of these conscripts get short training, not very good weaponry or other provisions, and are thrown into the battle. And the exact numbers are totally unknown. The Ukraine government says that it lost 800 soldiers, and of course many hundreds and thousands injured. Estimates on the rebel side of the Ukraine army and militia losses number in the thousands, and I think that's more accurate, certainly if you look at the reports and some of the visual outcomes of the fighting. Regardless, the soldiers of the Ukraine army have to also be seen as victims of this war, drawn into something which control over, and in many cases did not wish to serve and fight. So I want to stress that, because this has been a difficult humanitarian situation all around. Now, I spoke to you earlier of the coming to power of a right-wing government in February. I think you'll recall the media coverage of a really intense battle going on in the streets of Kiev at the time. And what was happening was a part of the historic fight over the future of Ukraine. Where does Ukraine's future lie? Does it lie in a kind of neutral status with a particular economic and cultural and even political relationship towards Russia? Or should it lie with the course that the new right-wing government proposed for Ukraine, which was a sharp break from its independence history? Ukraine became independent in 1991. Well, for the second time in history, that's a long story, but in modern times, became independent in 1991. And so the new right-wing government in February proposed a very sharp shift in economic, political, and every other imaginable policy for the country. That is a sharp shift away from close economic ties with Russia and with the countries economically associated with Russia towards an association with Europe, which would involve promises by Europe to provide substantive investment in the economy and also loans to the government in Kiev, provided, of course, the Kiev government carried out the typical policies when you get IMF loans, which is you cut social policies and you cut all the spending deemed uneconomic, and also you lower all of the measures that a national government and economy takes to protect or to promote its economy, whether it's in industry, agriculture, as the case may be. So a very sharp change in policy that was proposed. Now, many people in the west of Ukraine support this change because there is a view that a turn to Europe is approximately a turn to the Europe that some of us actually have known in our lifetime, others have studied, a Europe of a kind of a social welfare country of the 1960s and 70s, a country that was prepared to spend, a region of the world prepared to spend money on social programs and so on. And so that's in part what's motivating the people in Western Ukraine who want to see this turn, this economic turn towards Europe. There's a view that this will bring economic prosperity. And very, very importantly, is the hope and aspiration that eventually this could end up in Ukraine becoming a member of the European Union, which means the mobility of labor then becomes much more possible. Ukraine already has about 2 or 3 million people living and working in precarious conditions in Europe. And this is part of what the European Union has done, is it's freed the borders whereby the people who live in the poorest parts of the region in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe can migrate to become the precarious workers of France, Britain, Germany, and so on and so forth. So, this is a gamble that many people in Western Ukraine are prepared to take. They don't see the Europe of Greece and of Spain, let's say, of harsh austerity, of very precarious conditions for workers that don't have citizenship and so on. They're prepared to look beyond that and hope against hope that they can eventually land up in the Europe that they've heard about, which is the Europe of good social welfare and employment possibilities and all the rest. So that's the west of Ukraine. But in the east of Ukraine, there's a very different attitude to this, which is to say, whoa, we don't want to make this turn. Why would we? We have established industry. We have very close economic relations with Russia. Culturally and linguistically, the majority of us are Russian, and we also don't want to see any of those ties interrupted or broken. Russia itself is opposed to this turn by Ukraine because it has considerable economic consequences for Russia's economy, and even more importantly, it has important political as well as military consequences for Russia that I'll talk about, because hidden behind, or not so much hidden anymore, but behind the turn to economic association with Europe is military association through NATO, and Russia has very compelling reasons to not want to see that happen. So you had this Maidan movement, as it was called. It was urging this change, this turn towards Europe, and quite legitimately protesting the very authoritarian governmental rule that exists in Ukraine, has existed since independence for the past 25 years. Really no change with the ousted President Yanukovych. The presidents before him more or less ruled similarly. Ukraine is run by the billionaires who got their hands on the state property when property was privatized after the overthrow of the Soviet Union. That's also true in Russia. That's who the wealthy are today in Russia and Ukraine. They're the people who are well placed within political or economic places to take advantage of what was the largest privatization in history. That's the way to look at the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was the largest privatization of publicly owned enterprises in the history of the world. And of course, that's a very interesting story in its own right. But that's who came into power in Ukraine today, 25 years ago. That's who's in power today. But they've had back and forth among the economic elite of Ukraine as to what direction to choose. Is it Russia? Is it Europe? And it's, the history of the past 25 years is the push and pull back and forth. So February was a decisive break with the push and pull. Now it's Europe, and behind that NATO, come hell or high water. And as far as the people in the east of the country who don't agree with this and don't want to be part of it, put up and shut up. Now Ukraine has a highly centralized form of government, nothing resembling what we have in this country with provinces that have significant domain over economic, social, and other policy, or in the United States, where states also, exercise rights of taxation and so forth. Not the case in Ukraine. Those 24 regions of Ukraine that I showed you, those are boundaries, but politically the power is in Kiev. And this is one of the problems that the people in eastern Ukraine ran into. They don't even have elected governors. The governors are being appointed in eastern Ukraine by the new right-wing government that came into power. They were literally appointing the billionaires to become governors in places like Donetsk and Luhansk. And so, this was the problem. And so the people in these said, whoa, we got to have a discussion here because this is not working for us. But no. And so worse than the turn has been the association of the new government in Ukraine with the extreme right parties and militias, which were there, but which moved into the Maidan movement and into Maidan Square in Kiev in particular as a paramilitary force, and drove through the overturn of the elected President Yanukovych in February. So the fellow on the right is a notorious extreme rightist who's become a little bit more moderate now that they've actually acceded to ministerial posts. But I believe I'm correct in saying that the government that came into power in Kiev in February is the first government in Europe since World War II that has extreme rightists or fascists in the ministries of the government. I don't mean in the parliament as you have in France. I'm talking in the ministries of the government, including Père Bouy here. So, much to be concerned about. This was a torchlight parade in Kiev earlier this year in commemoration of Stefan Bandera, who's one of the paramilitary leaders during World War II who fought with Nazi Germany against his own countrymen. And these battalions are finding the means to get both weapons and also training from NATO countries. The United States has committed $19 million, but there's several resolutions now in the U.S. Congress and Senate to really boost that funding. As a matter of fact, we don't really even know exactly what the flow of weaponry into Ukraine is today coming from NATO. But it's more than the war. This is the beginning of the economic austerity beginning to bite. The Kiev government has significantly cut its spending on social programs. Some factories have closed, like the bus factory in Lviv, which doesn't have its market anymore with Russia because everything's been upset and nobody knows what the future is. Are they still going to be able to sell buses in Russia? In particular, the area where the most of the fighting has happened in Donetsk and Luhansk, it's the industrial region of Ukraine, but in many respects it was also the industrial region of the former Soviet Union. It's where a lot of industry was built, partly because there's coal mines there. So it's a very historic industrial area that you just, that if this turn to austerity goes through, and much of that industry is finished because it's not competitive, so-called, with the industries in Europe, which under free trade, in which governments subsidize their industries through tax regimes and all sorts of other measures. But when it comes to dealing with other countries, free trade must have free trade. So the industries in eastern Ukraine, and in fact anywhere in the country, are extremely vulnerable to this opening up of Ukraine to to Europe. With lifting any kinds of restrictions for the movement of investment and of trade, to drastically cut social spending and all the like. So, this is one of the factors that's playing against the Kiev government in its turn, which is that how long are the people in Ukraine going to put up with war, with economic austerity, with these kinds of consequences? We'll see. That's still to be determined. Now, there's also been a sharp decline in civil and human rights in Kiev that have come in with both a right-wing government in power adopting very harsh and right-wing laws, but also right-wing militias running rampant in the streets of the city. This fellow who was attacked just a couple of days ago actually he's not an opponent of the Kiev government. He was very much a supporter of the Maidan movement and thinks that the war is sort of largely the responsibility of the people in the East who just won't accept what the Kiev government wants to do. And yet even he can be a victim of this kind of violence. Now, he's lucky he lived. There's been lots and lots of disappearances and of people unjustly imprisoned. Many people living in political exile, particularly in Crimea, also in Russia. I met them when we were at the conference in Russia. And more and more signs of the ascendance of right-wing nationalism in Ukraine, including anti-Jewish hatred. So this is also what the people throughout Ukraine are dealing with. The Kiev government has adopted a law which authorizes the police to shoot on sight anyone they deem to be conducting what they call separatist activity. The Kiev government's war in the east of the country, that is against its own population, they call it officially, formally it's called the Anti-Terrorist Operation, and they use the acronym for that, the ATO. Everybody knows what the ATO is in Ukraine. How do you treat people that you label terrorists? That is half your country. Well, not very well. Not in today's world. So, of course, using the term terrorist was a method to sell the war to Western public opinion. We have terrorists in Ukraine. Oh my gosh! But it's this has very harsh consequences for people's ordinary lives. Freedom of the press extremely restricted now in Ukraine, and so on. And you can't really have public demonstrations. If you do, you have to fight for your right to have them. And literally, you have a demonstration, and the rioters are going to show up and try and drive you off the street. So will the police protect you or not? Maybe, maybe not. Behind the Kiev government's offensive is NATO's offensive. NATO is on the warpath against Russia and against anyone else in Eastern Europe that gets in its way. This is not a new story. There was a temporary truce, shall we say, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the offensive is on, and the map shows it. If you take away Germany on the map, all these other countries in gray are the countries that have come into NATO membership in the past 25 years. This is an explicit contravention of the agreements that were made after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reordering of the political map in Eastern Europe. There was both formal and informal commitments made by NATO and by Western Europe and the United States that they would not take advantage of the chaotic situation to do what they've done. But they violated that, and they're doing it again in Ukraine because there is a plan to bring Ukraine into NATO, even if it will take some time, as it took to get Turkey into NATO. It will take some time. You have to have all political conditions set, and we'll see if that's what it comes to. When Petro Poroshenko came here, he spoke in Ottawa to the Parliament, or as a joint session of Parliament on September 11th, and then he spoke to a joint session of the Congress and the Senate 2 days later. What was his main message? Was it help us with health care? Help us with education, help us with economic investment. Here's our ideas. We have some very specific things to do. Maybe help us to ease the relations with Russia or whatever. No, give us weapons. And that alone says a great deal about the intention of the Kiev government, whether or not to live up to the ceasefire agreement that's been made. Because that was his main message in Ottawa and Washington. Give us more weapons. The government is now proposing to end the formal neutrality status, which Ukraine has had since becoming independent. It's set on a very openly declared course of joining the European Union and NATO. And there's just a host of other measures like this that indicate that we can't really have much confidence in the ceasefire. I mean, both sides are now, you know, re-equipping and getting ready for the worst. So it doesn't portend very well at all for the future in Ukraine, this course. What really set off the NATO offensive and the related war of Kiev was the decision of the people in Crimea to secede in March. And the reason they seceded was quite simple. They looked north. They saw a government in Kiev that was a very conservative government proposing the rupture, I said, but also an alliance with the fascist and extreme right parties and militias. And the people of Crimea said, "Get us out of here. We don't want any part to do. We don't want anything to do with this." Crimea is not historically a part of Ukraine. It became part of Ukraine in 1954 through an administrative decision of the Soviet Union at the time, which kind of made sense because they were in post-war reconstruction, and there was an awful lot to do. And the resources as well as the geographic connection there to Ukraine, it just made a lot more sense. So basically, an administrative switch was made over. Now, of course, there was a confluence of interests that went on here. Russia had a great interest in facilitating the secession of Crimea, and it did that. It did everything it could to facilitate that. But you can count on one hand the number of people that died through the course of that political conflict, less than one hand. So how many resolutions of an intensely dangerous conflict like that can you imagine in recent history that have been resolved with relatively little loss in life? There's no question that the majority of people of Crimea wanted out. They didn't want to be part of what they saw as a looming civil war. The events in southeast Ukraine have confirmed everything in what they've done. Plus, they had a considerable economic advantage in making the switch. They doubled their pensions overnight, and all around there's just more resources available for, and they are pouring a lot of resources into Crimea to develop it. I mean, obviously they want this secession, Russia wants this secession to be a success. I have a lot of very critical things to say about Russia today. I mentioned earlier how the economic conditions resemble Ukraine in many ways. This is a very unequal society with a lot of very wealthy people on the top who have enormous tax breaks that capitalists in this country can only dream of. But nonetheless, I think that's not the real issue that was involved here in Crimea. I think what we saw in Crimea was the expression of an act of self-determination by the Crimean people, number one, and number two, to get out of the way of a war that they didn't want, that they saw coming. Eastern Ukraine have all kinds of ideas of what they want. Some of them want to join Russia. Some of them want to be independent. They call it Novorossiya. I have the T-shirt that the Novorossiya movement has produced. They gave to us in Crimea. I didn't put it on tonight because this is a very controversial thing, and I appreciate that. And there are also people in Eastern Ukraine that want to stay with Ukraine, but I think for sure everybody says, hey, there's got to be some change here where we don't get a voice in Kiev. We get appointed governors. We don't get to vote on our governors. So it's a complex story, and I think my impression at this point in time is that the best course for the struggle in eastern Ukraine is to find allies in the rest of the country who reject war, reject austerity, and want to be one country. But definitely it's got to be under new political terms. Can't be the same old Ukraine. No, this has to be a country with significant political autonomy and self-determination accorded to the people in the east and also in the south. Because if you look at Odessa, I think is about 40% Russian language speakers as first language, but many other nationalities. And there are small nationalities in the west of Ukraine who have roughly the same complaint as the people in the east. The Rus, who number about 1 million, the Hungarians who've been there for centuries. There are some hundreds of thousands. There's Czechs, there's Germans. There's many different language and cultural groups in Ukraine who they don't want to separate. They just want to have a voice. They want to have more control over cultural policy, control over economic decision making, and so forth. They're not just complaining about a war from Kiev and fascist parties running amok in Kiev. They're talking about these billionaires that run our economy. We're fed up with it. we think maybe nationalizing their enterprises is a good idea. We want more spending on social service. It's a whole kind of progressive political mix that's going on in the east of Ukraine. But for sure, it's the war by Kiev that's driving people to demand, at minimum, very substantive forms of political autonomy and self-determination. That's obvious. I mean, who can live with a government that bombs you? I mean, it's just, I think it's very self-evident. You saw many of these flags in April and May when people in the east of Ukraine basically kind of said, well, we'll do what they did in Kiev with the Maidan movement. If they can occupy buildings to demand what they want, well, we can do the same thing. So lots of Russian flags. And this is where the beginnings of the Russian separatist talk began to happen, which is a simplification and a falsification of what's going on, and a quite deliberate one. Or it's done by lazy journalists and lazy editors who can't bother to find out what the real complex truth is. Now, there is resistance to all this in the west of Ukraine as well, and we saw very significant anti-war and anti-conscription protests beginning in June by the relatives of the conscript soldiers who were learning of the very, very difficult conditions that their husbands and sons were facing once conscripted and sent to fight in the east. In fact, that was one of the indications that we began to get of how bad things were going for the Ukrainian army, because the families were saying, we don't want our son or our husband to get conscripted and sent off to war because we're finding it means certain death for them. We saw that phrase used quite a bit, certain death. So that was a certain indication there, what people estimated what the Ukrainian army was accomplishing. So these were quite militant protests that went on. Now, this is a minority of the population in Western Ukraine, but I think was a considerable factor in the government's decision to call the ceasefire. And also the beginnings of protests against, the cuts to healthcare, the cuts to education, everything that's accompanied the war. I spent a week in Moscow, and the thing that really impressed me, the first time I've ever been there, is, hey, people in Russia are kind of like the people in Canada I grew up with. And they want the same things that we do. They have complaints about their government like we do, and we should stop. We shouldn't accept the demonization of Russia that's gone on in media and government. It's a very dangerous thing for the world, and it's also totally phony and false. People in Russia will have as many complaints or more with their government than many of us will have in Canada. So let's give the Russian people their due, and let's look at them as friends and allies in a struggle to build a just and equal world, and a world against war and a world against militarism.
You can agree or disagree with Roger Annis about NATO's directly or indirectly enforcing the will of Western oligarchies. If you want to express your opinion about Canada's affiliation with NATO, and if you want your initiative to be counted, then go to nowpolling.ca. Here you choose Canadian Federation, and from Canadian Federation you look at security and police, and here is the poll: affiliation with NATO and NORAD. Remember, silence on political issues translated to acceptance of the status quo. On the other hand, participation is the essence of direct democracy. I am Yon del Sol Moruso.